The following program is seen statewide on California Public Television. He was the father of the modern-day conservation and environmental movements, founder of the Sierra Club, and known as the father of our national park system. A naturalist who became an honest-to-goodness California icon. And John Muir, through his many writings and his philosophy of preserving and conserving our precious natural resources, continues to affect life in our state today, many years after his death in 1914. His home in Martinez is a National Historic Site, a beautiful place visited by thousands of people every year. Ironically enough, a home that almost didn't survive, which in itself is a fascinating story. A story that takes place in one of California's golden parks.
I love you, California. You're the greatest state of all.
I'm standing here with Ranger Tad Shea from the National Park Service. We're standing in front of this beautiful Muir house, which is it's listed as technically as
a National Historic Site.
A National Historic Site. Tell us the story of this beautiful old Muir house.
Well, this house was built in 1882, and it was built by Muir's father-in-law, Dr. John Strensel. Muir did not move in until 1890. His wife was from Martinez here, so he moved in with his wife, his two daughters, and he lived here with his mother-in-law, and he wrote a lot of his books here, as well as running a huge fruit ranch which surrounded the home here.
All right, now, so he lived here about how many years?
He lived here for the last 24 years of his life.
Really? Now, did he, because I always thought he was out in the wilderness.
Well, this was really his home base, so we'd like to think of it that way. He did do a lot of world traveling. Muir visited every continent on the planet but one. He never made it to Antarctica. But boy, he went everywhere else. Alaska, Yosemite, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, all these different places.
But this was always his home base.
It sure was.
Now, would this have been considered a mansion back then?
Oh, certainly. Muir's father-in-law, Dr. Strensel, was very wealthy. He was a well-known and well-respected medical doctor, so he was able to afford to build such a beautiful home like this.
And when they lived here, though, this was probably kind of out in the country, wasn't it?
Oh, certainly, certainly. The Muirs had about 1,000 acres immediately around the house here, with nothing but orchards in them.
We're upstairs inside the Muir house because Tad has brought us to what has to be the most historic and the most important room in this whole house.
That's right, Huell. This is what Muir called his scribble den.
Scribble den.
Yeah, Muir liked to write with a quill pen when he was out in the wilderness and even when he was back here in Martinez. So Muir wrote 12 books. He had 10 of them published in over 300 magazine articles. And he wrote them right there at that desk.
At that exact desk?
That's right. His daughters had given the desk to Yosemite after Muir passed away in 1914, and we got it back in 1964 after we became part of the National Park Service.
Boy, this room really has a very interesting feel to it, to think that Muir himself was in here doing his work. What would he do? Go out into nature and take notes and then bring them back in here and put them in book form, in essay form?
That's right. Muir kept journals all the time, and from those journals he would transcribe them into either magazine articles or books, and would do it right here in this room. So he felt most comfortable here in this room.
So did he think of this house as his home or as his home/office?
Probably his home/office. Most writers have a difficult time writing, and Muir was that way as well. It was always difficult to pull the words out and get them down right, but after a little bit of relaxing with the family, he was able to come up here, get some peace and quiet, and do the writing that he knew would enchant people with wilderness areas.
Right there at that desk.
So true.
There's a lot to see here, and leaving Muir's Scribble Den. We've come down into the back 40 down here because there's a lot of neat stuff to see right off the bat. This looks like part of one of his original orchards.
Right. These aren't the original trees that were planted here. They would have been long gone by now. But this is a representative of the types of fruits that they did grow here.
Now, why would he be into having an orchard on his ranch?
Even though his father-in-law was a medical doctor, his father-in-law was really interested in horticulture. Muir, of course, was a botanist, and he loved plants. So, of course, they got along really well on that subject. And it was something, since Muir loved plants, hey, what's the next best natural step is to move on into taking care of trees for a living.
And what did he have down here? What kind of an orchard? Did he make money? What did he do with all this fruit?
They made quite a bit of money. Muir and his wife Louie were very astute business people. They made quite a bit of money from running the fruit ranch here. They had many different kinds of fruits and nuts that they grew here. They didn't keep all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. They had many different kinds of apples, pears, plums, peaches, grapes, anything that you can think of.
So this was a working ranch.
It sure was. It sure was.
And even though this isn't the original orchard, you pointed out something over here that is original, and boy, it's a beauty too.
Yeah, this sequoia tree was brought here to Martinez by Muir. He wrapped it up as a seedling and wrapped it in a wet handkerchief and carried it here to Martinez. It's just a baby. It's only about 95 years old. It's kind of out of its element. It really should be in the high Sierra, so it's a little dry here for it, but still, it's growing strong.
Well, this is great, though, because to be able to visit an actual tree that was planted by John Muir. Do we know for sure? How do we know that he planted this tree?
Because Muir talked about it. He did mention that he brought a tree here. He brought a sequoia. He wanted to have something that represented the high Sierra, and sure enough, this would do it. And he brought it here and planted it.
Wow, this is beautiful, and it all fits in with the orchard. You got the old windmill. Mm-hmm. It's very easy to kind of go back in time and imagine
it sure is.
What this place was like in the late 1800s when the Muir family actually lived and ranched here.
Right. We kind of hope that people get the spirit of John Muir by coming here. They realize that Muir was a very complex man. He wasn't only just a great writer and a preservationist, but he was also a family man, and he ran this huge fruit ranch.
Okay, we have toured the Muir home. We have toured the Muir orchards. We have a firm understanding, I think, of just how significant this wonderful old Muir house is. Mm-hmm. And a beautiful house it is. It's been so lovingly restored. But Tad, this house, this Muir house, didn't always look this good, did it?
No, it didn't, Huell. There were a lot of problems with the home. It was abandoned for a number of years. Hobos from riding the trains were coming in, setting fires, ripping things apart. So it really almost didn't make it.
It was falling down.
It really was. There were bats in the belfry and all sorts of things.
Literally like bats in the belfry.
Literally.
And we're talking, what, about the 1930s, the 1940s, the
right.
early 50s?
Correct, yeah, the late 1930s, 40s, and early 50s.
Now, what was going to happen to the old house?
It's possible that the home could have been razed, and homes, developments were coming through in the early 60s and so forth. That's how people were living back then, and so it's possible it could have been razed and they could have built homes right up to the freeway.
So this was literally in danger of disappearing forever.
True, true.
And this story points out just how important one person can be to history. Because now it's time to meet the real star of our show right here, Fair Sachs. Yeah. We are delighted to have you here, and your story, your connection with this old Muir house is very interesting because you and your husband lived here. You bought this old house and saved it from destruction. Tell us the story of that first day when you walked up here in 1955 and saw this old house falling down.
Well, I felt sorry for the old house because I knew that it should be saved, and I didn't know who was going to do that. But I always knew that old houses were important when people lived in them. And so I remember I went to the house, through the house, and I came to the understanding that it had a part of history. I didn't know just how much or what anybody could do.
But you needed to save it.
Yes.
Can you remember the first day you saw this old house?
Well, yes, because there was a sign up, and you couldn't get up into the house very well because the steps were all coming out, and many of the windows had been shot by kids with their shooters, just for fun.
So it was a mess.
It was a mess, and all my friends and anybody that had ever seen the old house thought, what a shame, that old house ought to be torn down because it's just such a mess.
Well, did you feel a little overwhelmed at what you had ahead of you? Did you think you could make it all work?
Well, I didn't know, but it just came to me that this old house had a story, and I began to read about what John Muir had done, because you could find a book occasionally, maybe not in town, but you could find a book that mentioned what he'd done. So I began to read all I could find about John Muir.
But actually, you were doing your reading in between cleaning up the old house.
Well,
which was a full-time job.
It was a hard thing for me to insist on my husband buying the house, because he said, I just built you a nice house to live in over on the hill. And I said, yes, but this old house needs somebody to love it and care for it and keep it going, because John Muir was a very important person. I've been reading all about him.
So you set out to fix this old house up.
Yeah, and everybody in town nearly thought we were crazy, except some of our good friends that knew us. They just said they would help us in any way they could. So there was one man, he's dead now, but he even helped my husband take the paint off and paint part of the house.
So you literally tackled this project yourselves.
Yeah, we did, just the two of us. And when people say you're crazy, you just don't have to think about that part of it. Just think ahead about what it could be. So that's what we did.
We're inside the Muir house, and it looks pretty nice in here now. What did it look like when you all moved in?
Well, I wish you could have seen it. When we moved in, there was no wallpaper on anything. There were no rugs. There was no furniture. There was absolutely nothing here.
What about the fireplace, this beautiful fireplace?
Well, these two places were gone. These two columns were gone.
How'd you get them back?
Well, we found out that there was a lady. She looked us up. She wanted to know if we had found the pieces of the fireplace. I said, no, where should I look? She said, you look in a box up in the attic, because she said, I came by there one day when the house was just open, and I walked in and looked around, and I could see that there were pieces of the fireplace that were on the floor. So she said, I picked them all up, put them in a box, and took them up to the attic and hid them under the little stairway. And she said, they're still up there.
So you went up and found them,
yeah.
And did you and Henry put all this back together?
We found this one. That's the original one. Mm-hmm. But the others had to be made.
Now, what about this wonderful wood in this room? Is this redwood back in this room behind us?
Yes, it is. This house was built so that you could keep it cool. Mm-hmm. And that way there's one outside, and then there's an inside of where they put stones and rocks, mm-hmm. And then there's the inside of the house.
Now the redwood looks to me like that it has stood up pretty well.
Yeah, it has in here.
What about the rest of the house?
Well, it all had to be redone, as you could see, and it had to be very careful. We didn't let anybody do any work unless they knew what to do.
We have now moved into another, you call these parlors, right?
Parlors, yes.
Now, how do you know what these rooms, how these rooms were used and what they were called?
Well, we went up to visit John Muir's daughter, Helen, and she told us all she could remember, so I took notes. And then she was mostly interested in the trees and the shrubs and the flowers. So with her vast knowledge of what the house had looked like, that helped us to know what to do. John Muir liked this one, and he had it rebuilt so that he could have a big log and put it in there, and it would last maybe 4 or 5 days.
How did you feel living in this house? Was his spirit kind of in the house?
Well, in a way, I wanted it to be authentic as we could make it. I wanted to save the house, we'll put it that way.
But you never did feel any of John Muir's vibes in here?
Well, yes and no. When I was real tired, sometimes I used to think, what would John Muir think about this house if he could come back and see it?
Well, he'd probably appreciate you saving it.
Well, I hope so.
Now the plot thickens because we've added 3 more to our cast of characters here. This is Florence Sachs. Now, you married Fair's nephew.
Yes.
And Fair and her husband put you all to work right away in this house, didn't they?
They really did.
Tell us what they had you doing.
Well, they had my husband and Henry were out in the yard with all the weeds, piling them in big piles, and that was in the days before the control and smog, and they had bonfires going here, not literally day and night, but pretty near.
Just clearing out all the brush.
That's what they did.
And what about, do you remember coming in here in those early days, what the house looked like and felt like when they started working on it?
The only, what I would call livable room in this house was the library, which the redwood paneling did. And there were literally bats in the belfry because the whole 3rd floor was nothing but bats.
You had bats in your belfry?
Yeah, bats, right.
Well, they were historic bats.
Well,
they were John Muir bats.
They were up in the attic.
Now, let's introduce these 2 ladies because you all kind of represent, Fair kind of brought you into the fold too, and explain to us how the local ladies of Martinez were involved in the Muir house in those early days.
Well, the Fair was involved with almost every organization in town. She was very important in many places in the community before she became important up here. But so she drafted us because we were members of a chapter of PEO that to which she belonged, and she drafted us as hostesses for open houses here.
Now, what was the purpose of these open houses?
Well, to have people from town realize that the house was here and was being taken care of.
So she would have open houses.
Oh, yes, she did. And she'd dress up. She'd be just wonderful. The bonnet, and she'd have these great clothes on, and she'd greet them at the door and welcome them. It was just wonderful. And she had a lot of people coming. They would come.
And this was a way to introduce the local citizens of Martinez to this jewel, which in a way they had kind of forgotten about.
That's right. They had kind of ignored it, really. And she just inspired them to know that it's here and appreciate it. I think it was wonderful she did this because she wouldn't have had to do it, but she did it.
And everybody in town then began to get on the Muir House restoration bandwagon.
Well, I don't know that we could say everyone in town, but there was still a certain amount of foot dragging, I think Fair would agree. But there were some very interested citizens who are all now gone, would like to have had them here, because I remember there was one man in particular, Westwood Wallace, who had been very instrumental in bringing up the idea of making this a memorial to John Muir. And he and others like him later formed, I believe that's true, Fair, they later formed the John Muir Association.
So this thing kind of grew and grew. Tad, come on back in here, because this is where the National Park Service comes in. At some point, after you and your husband had lived here for about 12 years, you decided to donate this or to sell this to the National Park Service to perpetuate it forever.
Well, but before that, we had something that happened that scared us to do that. And that was the newspaper came out and said that there was going to be a street put right through the Muir property this way and another street right through the Muir property this way, and it would have torn us into 4 different particles.
Development,
and we couldn't have that. So that drove us to try to get the National Park Service interested.
And were they interested right away?
Right away. The National Park Service was more than happy to finally get a hold of Muir's home in 1964.
And did you get rich when you sold it to the government?
No, we could have turned down $500,000 for this house and the land. Remember the land that went with us, and that didn't include the old adobe and the land that went with that, but we sold it for just what we'd paid for it plus our improvements. Wow. And everybody thought we were crazy.
People have been thinking you all were crazy for a long time.
Yeah.
But thank goodness you were crazy, because today this is here because really of you and your husband, Henry.
Yeah, it would have been torn down. It really would have been.
Well, this is a story, isn't it? This is a real success story about the difference one person or a small group of people can make if they have it in their heart to make that difference.
Don't forget my husband. He's dead now, but he was the one that had to do all the hard work.
Yeah. Well, we won't forget you or your husband, because you are part of the legacy of the Muir house as much as the Muir family itself, because if it hadn't been for the Saxes, this house might not even be here today.
So true. That is so true. We really appreciate all that Henry and Fair did for us.
Well, this has been a wonderful day. I feel like I can't meet John Muir in person, but you're the next best thing. And this has been a wonderful day spent in this wonderful historic place here in Northern California, this John Muir home, which now belongs to all of us, thanks to this lady and her husband and all of her friends and supporters over the years. This place, which is very much one of California's golden parks.
Yes, it is.
Well, hello everybody, I'm Huell Hauser, and I sure hope you enjoyed this adventure in one of California's golden parks. You know, we have so many wonderful parks in our state, all of them well worth a visit. And if you'd like to go on this particular adventure again, share it with family or friends, or perhaps donate a copy to your local school or library. Well, it's available on DVD. All you have to do is call 1-800-266-5727, and we'll be glad to send it to you right away.